Now to the three independents who may be about to decide Australia's next government. There's Tony Windsor, who's represented the seat of New England in New South Wales, centred in Tamworth since 2001. There's Bob Katter, who entered the federal parliament for the North West Queensland seat of Kennedy as a National Party member in 1993, turning independent in 2001. And finally, there's Rob Oakeshott, who entered the federal parliament for the seat of Lyne, based in Port Macquarie in New South Wales, in a by-election in 2008. All have previously served in their state parliaments, and they all join me now by satellite. Can we start with an update on how things will proceed from here? We know you've had preliminary conversations with the leaders. We know you're all going to meet, that is, the three of you are going to meet in Canberra sometime tomorrow. What then? Tony Windsor.
Well, Kerry, we've spoken on the phone, but nothing has been decided in any definitive way. We have had calls from the leader of the opposition and the Prime Minister, but nothing definitive discussed there. I've said to both of them that I'm quite happy to sit down and talk if, in fact, there is a hung parliament and we need to resolve the situation. The three of us will be engaged in some talks by phone a bit later on tonight, and we'll make a decision then as to whether we should get face-to-face in Canberra, which may happen tomorrow.
OK, but will you ultimately conduct your negotiations with Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott together as a block of three or separately?
Well, I can't speak for the others, but I think that would depend on our conversations as to how we handle this. But we'll all be independent of each other in a sense, but there may be an easier way of handling it if we speak together, but the others are able to speak for themselves.
Bob Katter and Rob Oakeshott, have you got anything to add on that in a kind of procedural sense before we move on to the meat of this discussion?
Yeah, look, I would say from a process point of view, there's a lot of sense in the three of us certainly staying shoulder to shoulder as much as possible for the interests of the Parliament and the nation, so that leaders don't have to talk individually to all of us, we don't get picked off by political interests and vested interests, and that we can keep the focus genuinely on the outcome of a parliament that can work for the next 3 years. So we will all be independent when the parliament's up and running, and when legislation comes through a parliament. There is no question about that. We are all independently minded and might draw our own conclusions about who and where we want to support or don't support a majority government. But I think there's a lot of sense in these early days, as the dust settles, that we do stand shoulder to shoulder to try and drive some stability outcomes for the next 3-year term.
Bob Katter, does that make sense to you?
I feel very strongly that we should act as far as humanly possible collectively. We don't agree on everything, and that's the nature of being an independent. But on basic central philosophy, I find myself in step all of the time with Rob and with Tony, and I think that we will be able to deliver a different paradigm for Australia if we act collectively, and I'm very, very strong that we do act collectively.
You've all had history with the National Party in one way or another. Although I know, Tony Windsor, that you've never sat in the Parliament, unlike the other two, as a member of the National Party. But what were the forces that decided each of you to take the independent route in politics? Tony Windsor first.
Well, I've never been there as a member of the National Party. I stood for pre-selection back in 1991, and I won't get into the antics that went on then, but I was unsuccessful, and I was encouraged to stand as an independent because of the branch stacking and other things that occurred, and subsequently won the state seat of Tamworth. But the legacy of that, I guess, was that some years previously I had, as a card-carrying member of the National Party, been quite critical of the way in which it was performing back then, and many of the things that I was talking about back then in terms of representation have come to fruition. And I think, well, quite obviously, the National Party is a dying party, and they'll amalgamate to save some of their skins within a couple of years.
And Bob Katter, what was it that ultimately decided you to go independent?
You got about 2 hours, Kerry.
How about 45 seconds?
But let me just say to you that I represent about more than a third of Australia's sugar industry. They cold-bloodedly went ahead and removed the tariffs, which halved the amount of money we got for sugar on the home market, about a quarter of our production. That was a savage blow to us. Why would you do that? What was the benefit? The price went up for the consumers, but I got out, I think it was some months after dairy deregulation, and we fought like tigers to try and stave that off and get our front bench to oppose that. Almost all of the backbenchers did that, but it was just a joke. I mean, they were going to facilitate and precipitate that dairy deregulation. Now, the outcome of that was that the price went up by about 40 cents to the consumer. My bloke's just got a letter in the mail saying, you're getting 58 cents. Sorry about that, you've been deregulated now. You're getting only 39 cents. So they had a third of their income taken away from them. And within 2 years of dairy deregulation, there was a farmer committing suicide every 4 days in Australia.
Okay.
Now, how could you possibly stay in a political institution that closed down the tobacco industry, the fishing industry, half the sugar industry, half the dairying industry, and didn't reinstate the timber industry in North Queensland? And that's just a few things.
Okay, well, that gives us an idea.
They sold off. No. One other thing that's of vital importance. They sold off the development banks. You know, that was the most mortal blow for rural Australia. And they sold them off so they get enough money in the till to buy their way through the next election.
Okay. Rob Oakeshott, what was it that determined your course into independence?
Well, it was 4 elections ago, so nearly 10 years, so it's hard to remember the detail, but essentially my focus when I first entered Parliament, and has always been, is community first and working with a local community. I bought the product that the particular party in question represents regional Australia. When I got on the inside, I quickly saw otherwise and had to make some decisions of sticking with community or sticking with party. I chose community and have been very happy with that decision, and hopefully, as you can see from election results, so has the community. Realistically, I was a square peg in a round hole from day one, and I think it was best for all involved that we chose different directions. And you know, there's no animosity at my end. I'm happy to work with the National Party if that's the implied question, if they are serious about trying to drive outcomes in the next Parliament. But in the end, I'm an independent member, very happy to be so is the electorate, and hopefully the country gets to see a bit of a taste of independent representation through this process and starts to look for it on a broader scale, because I think that reinvestment in the original concept of a Parliament is really important for Australia today.
Okay, and in fact, you got me right. That was going to be the follow-up question, and I'll put it to Tony Windsor and Bob Katter very quickly, and that is whether that National Party relationship is a help or a hindrance in forging a workable relationship with the coalition. And I notice in particular, Tony Windsor and Bob Katter, that that doesn't seem to me that there's a very close relationship between you two and Barnaby Joyce, and possibly even Warren Truss, given what he had to say.
Well, I have a view that Barnaby Joyce is a fool and is actually an embarrassment to country Australia, so I don't have a lot of time for him. I think he's done a lot of damage, and to give advice on hung parliaments is nonsense. Barnaby Joyce actually was in a hung Senate when the sale of Telstra went through, and had certain guarantees that were going to be enshrined in legislation in relation to equity of access to broadband and telephone services, for instance. That legislation never incorporated any enshrinement of those rights. There was supposed to be a letter from the Prime Minister that would guarantee them. That was never cited, and we're still arguing about telecommunication services. So, but having said that, there's, you know, I've been a great admirer of Kay Hull, for instance. I think she stood up on the Snowy Hydro scheme and a number of other issues. So there are some good members of all parties, and the National Party's not bereft of good members. It's just that it doesn't have many.
Bob Catter, anything to add?
I just thought, for an act of incredible stupidity, I watched Barnaby have a cheap shot at Tony Windsor. I could have thought of no more foolish action than that. And then Warren Truss carried a personal attack upon me. I mean, quite extraordinary stuff. Tony Abbott must have been grinding his teeth watching it. But no, look, I believe that you've got to work. I've worked with people that I loathe and detest. I've had to work with them in the past. Whatever can get a good outcome for our areas. But I emphasise continuously the collapse of agriculture in Australia. And you know, this is the thing that must be addressed. We need a different paradigm. Tony Windsor said that it's like a giant lot feeder. We just keep putting cattle into, referring to Sydney and southeast Queensland, and then we just can't fit any more cattle into that lot feeder. You could turn some of them back into the paddock. But if you look after rural Australia, you'll move the people back, and that will relieve the incredible pressure on infrastructure in Sydney and in southeast Queensland. And water, you know, it is very relevant to my area, water development. But we saw none of it under the LNP, and we had a different and more aggressive approach, I've got to say, in fairness to the ALP, quite incredible.